Welcome to Veteran State of Mind. I'm your host, Geraint Jones. It's been a while, guys, and I apologise. It's been very busy on this end. Got a few books on the go and everything like that. And I've been out of the country a bit. But I'm back now, so we've got a couple of episodes coming up over the next couple of weeks. Today's episode is a really fascinating one. I just want to say, guys, as well, obviously, this is an episode about the war dead, and I know that can be, it is a very emotional subject. You know, one of the things that we will talk about in the podcast is the recovery of dead and that kind of thing. So just be warned, if that's something that will upset you to a point where, you know, you might get very upset, then just be warned that it's in there. When we get to that part in the episode, John will actually give you a heads up. You skip a few minutes ahead at that point. But yeah, I just wanted to give you guys a heads up on that, not trying to trip anybody up here. We talk a lot on this podcast about remembrance, about why remembrance is so important and everything like that. And we all know something about it. We all go to remembrance parades. You know, we remember friends that we've lost, or maybe if you haven't served, you know, you go and remember the people from your village or your town or your local regiment that were lost. But I didn't realize how much about remembrance I didn't know, and particularly how much, and this will be something that anybody who's visited the First World War graves in particular will know, is the story of the unknown warriors, which, you know, is one of those things where we see these graves with no name, no regiment, no nothing like that. It's just a grave of a British soldier and nothing else is known about them. Someone has now written a book about that. That man is John Nichol, and he's an impressive bloke. So I'm going to actually get a piece of paper out here for his CV, and I'm going to read you a little bit about John. So I'm sure many of you are already very familiar with John, if you're interested in anything military-wise. John Nichol served in the Royal Air Force for 15 years. On active duty during the first Gulf War in 1991, his Tornado bomber was shot down during a mission over Iraq. Captured, tortured, and held as a prisoner of war, John was paraded on television, provoking worldwide condemnation and leaving one of the most enduring images of the conflict. John is the best-selling co-author of Tornado Down and author of many highly acclaimed epics, including Spitfire, Lancaster and Tornado, all of which were Sunday Times bestsellers. He has made a number of TV documentaries with Second World War veterans, written for national newspapers and magazines, and is a widely quoted commentator on military affairs. He's also a top bloke, and he has made, and I'm very lucky to read a lot of books. It's one of the best things about my job, quite honestly, is having an excuse to read. And I'm dead straight when I say this, that this is one of the best books I have read in my life. Usually when I sit down and read a book, I usually tend to blast out in a day. This one, I had to take it in chunks because each chapter is so powerful and it was teaching me so much that it's one of those ones that you just had to kind of let sink in. Obviously, the subject matter is quite heavy, obviously, because we're talking about our war dead, which is, you know, not an easy subject to read about, but it really is, I think, one of the most important books, certainly, that I've read in a long time. I haven't come across anything else like it. And it's the kind of book that I think once you read it, I'm not even exaggerating by saying that it will change your life, because you will look at remembrance and everything around it in a different light going forwards. If you're a veteran, if you have kids who you want to educate about this kind of stuff, or if you're just someone if you're interested in the military, honestly, if you're listening to this podcast, you should read this book. I know I always plug books. There's a good reason, because if a book's good, that's why I want the author on the podcast. But this really is exceptional. And I've said enough about it. I just want to say thank you to everyone who continues to listen to the podcast. I know I haven't been around as much as I should be. I'm starting to sound like you're missing Dad now, but no. I will be around more, son, I promise. But listen, guys, thanks for bearing with us. Thanks for being here today. And if you're gonna share any episode of the podcast, please make it this one, because remembrance is bigger than all of us, and it's something that we should all strive to push and bring as many people into the kind of the fold, so to speak, as we can. So without further ado, here is Mr. John Nichol. John, welcome to the podcast, mate. Good to have you on. How are you?
Hey guys, thanks for having me on, mate. Sharing a beer with you was a great delight. Sharing a natter with you I'm sure will be mildly interesting for other people. Well, we'll see.
Well, mate, we've talked about your book in person, and I was lucky enough to get an early read on it, and I do think it's one of the best books I've read in years. And I'm interested in military history, and I learn a heck of a lot of this, and more than that, something we try and hit on this podcast a lot, and something that's near and dear to all of our listeners is the kind of idea of remembrance and the importance of remembrance. And we can talk a bit more about that, but what I just want to get into to begin with is it's such a big topic when you get down to this. Where did the idea come from for something that, we all kind of know of these unknown warriors, but is it something that you've always had an interest in, or was it something that you kind of just stumbled upon, this idea for the book?
Well, mate, I think in reality, I had known about the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior in Westminster Abbey. I mean, I've been there a load of times. I know that it's there. I know what it represents. But what I did not know is the history behind it. And so I went there. It was the 100th anniversary of the Royal Air Force in 2018. I kind of should know these days off the top of my head. And I was with a World War II veteran who had taken to Westminster Abbey, and I was wheeling him out. We're going off to the after-service party, which, as you know, anybody in the military prefers the after-service party to anything else. And he stopped me at the tomb which sits at the entrance to the West Door. And he chatted to me about it, and he told me about the fact that there is somebody buried there. And I knew what it represented, but when you read the inscription, it says, "Buried here, an unknown warrior." And he was explaining that in November 1920, they brought back to England the remains of an unknown soldier to represent those who'd been lost. And then, so we then talked about this. And the big thing that caused the clicking moment that said, I really am interested in this story, was he said that just over 1 million service personnel from the First World War died. Just over 1 million. And of those million, just over 500,000 have no known grave. So for me, the concept of over 500,000 men having no known grave was astonishing. I couldn't comprehend it. And so then I decided I was going to embark on this journey, which has resulted in the book and the theatre show.
Those numbers are just simply staggering. I went to a Second World War graveyard recently, and you come across the odd one, and, known unto God, and, there's the odd one, but overwhelmingly there's a name, there's a cap badge, there's an inscription, there's an age. So this idea of just people not being known at the time, I mean, why was that? What was the reason there was so many unknown warriors?
The 500,000, mate, that is staggering. So, we both kind of served on the front line, and the concept of 500,000 comrades, nobody knows who they are or what happened to them or where they went. So in the First World War, it was really very different to when we served. And so the reasons, the means that somebody could become lost, somebody could become unknown, were legion. So there's a number of different ways. So the first thing is that obviously shell fire, massive artillery bombardments. And if you're hit by a 155, there's nothing left of you. And I've got a number of accounts in the book and in the show about there's one guy who says our officer was hit by a shell, and all that remained was a foot in a boot for us to bury. So that, in many ways, I suppose, is self-explanatory. But then you have the people who were buried. So a lot of what I talk about in the book is the padres, the men, and now, of course, the women who buried the dead on the battlefield. And so they would bury the dead, but during the First World War, the battles were ongoing. So I talk about at the beginning of the book, Highwood during the Battle of the Somme, and Padre David Rilton, and he buries 47 of his comrades in a shell hole on the edge of Highwood in the midst of the battle. And so he marks it, and he has registered the graves. But on some occasions, those who are burying the dead on the battlefield during the battlefields were then killed. And so they've buried the dead, they've marked the grave, sometimes with an upturned rifle. But then, and there's a number of accounts of this, they walk away and they're hit by a shell. And so they are killed. The records of the people they are buried are killed. So that's two ways. I was almost staggered, surprised. I shouldn't have been surprised, I suppose, by this. The dead were buried and registered, and the information was sent back to headquarters. But then the ongoing battles flowed back and forwards. And so the graves were blasted apart by the ongoing battles and the shell fire, and the dead bodies and the remains were blasted out and scattered. And so the ways somebody could become unknown, never mind blasted apart by shell fire or being lost to the mud of Flanders fields or the Somme, were legion. And so as part of my journey, that's what I try to express. That's what I try to cover and to tell the reader and the listener.
So there's one person, one soldier, one unknown warrior buried in Westminster Abbey. What happened to the rest of them, those that could be found, those that did have registered graves that were known on these battlefields, that did survive the shelling and everything?
During the First World War, nobodies, or almost nobodies, apart from a few, were returned to the loved ones. And this was actually quite normal at that era. It would never happen now. And if you know anything about the Falklands, or obviously the Gulf, Iraq, Afghanistan, that would never happen now. But back then, the concept that nobody would be returned home was normalized. And so those who were identified were buried. And if you go to the Great War cemeteries, and I know you have been there, you will see, you said it, cap badges, names, ages, Royal Artillery, Colonel Smith, Captain this, Private so-and-so, Lance Corporal. But there's another group of people who were buried. They had the bodies, but they didn't know who they were. They couldn't identify them. The days of you and I wearing two identity tags, the days, and this is probably more important, that the people that you served alongside, and in these cases died alongside, knew who you were. Back then, if 10,000 people died on the first day or the second day of a battle, you wouldn't know. And so there are then a huge amount of people who are buried, and you'll have seen the headstones, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God, because they don't know who it is. So you've got the category of people who are buried, but we don't know who they were. And we've got the category of people who were never buried and we don't know anything about it. So we have bodies with no names, and we have names with no bodies. And that is the premise of the story of the book and the theatre show.
Was the general public okay with this idea of not having people returned?
Well, I think some people accepted it because it was the norm, and there had been previous battles, of course. And in the book, I talk about some of the previous battles where, and it's quite horrific. So Waterloo, we ground up the bones of the dead to use as fertilizer. And there was a.
Hang on, I want you to say that twice, mate, because I've always found this one of the most pivotal battles in British history, arguably the most. And we ground up the dead. The heroes who died at Waterloo, British heroes, were ground up for fertilizer.
Oh, not just that, Gez. So there is something, if you look at the British dentistry files from the late 1800s and the 1900s, there's something called Waterloo teeth, false teeth. And they came from the dead of the Battle of Waterloo. So people were sent to the battlefield. It's all to talk about. They were sent to the battlefields to pull out the teeth of the dead to be made into false teeth. Waterloo teeth was a thing. And we didn't bring anybody home then. There was not really the logistics or the means to do that. So we buried them. They were burnt in pits. It was really quite bad. But we also ground up the bones for fertilizer. And there are a number of accounts, and I use them in the book as a lead into why this happened, of ships arriving in the eastern Great Docks of, Hull. And they were full of the ground up bones of British servicemen to be used as fertilizer. And here's another thing I was staggered about. In actual fact, there's a proposal written in the files, in the archives, in the letters, to do the same with the dead of the First World War. grind them up, bring them home. And it's the person who's proposing it says, wouldn't they prefer to be scattered on the fields as fertilizer? I mean, it's beyond comprehension.
I mean, yeah, that's an interesting one. Interesting one. I mean, I'm all for crazy business ideas, disrupt the market and stuff, but that is that's a little out there.
It got short shrift, my friend. It got short shrift.
Yeah. I mean, so these, you said these bodies were reburied a lot of the times. How did that come about? Because, I mean, imagine, considering it always blows my mind that we're 100 years or so from the First World War. The First World War was 100 years or so from Waterloo. So considering 100 years before that, we were grinding people into fertilizer, where did this whole, now, anyone who's been to a British cemetery will know how well kept they are, how well ordered they are. Beautiful, really. Terribly sad, but beautiful. That must have been a new thing. Where did that come from?
Massively new. This was a massively new project. And so this started, and again, I didn't know anything about this till I started writing. This started the beginning of the war. And what we now know as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Fabian Ware, a man who's volunteered to fight but wasn't accepted because he was old, he decided to head off into the battlefields. First of all, he was trying to find the lost men who'd been lost. If you've got 100,000 men going over the top of a 10-mile front, some of them get lost. And it's almost incomprehensible for us to think about that, but they did. So he was trying to find the lost. But what he found was bodies. And so he started collecting the bodies, and he had a team, and they started bringing the bodies back to the edges of let's call them the battle zones, and having them buried. So some of them in the aftermath of, say, one day of a big battle, one day of the Somme, one day of the Battle of High Wood, which is just a minuscule fraction of the deaths of the First World War. There would be the comrades or the padres or the burial parties would bury the dead at the edge of the battlefield, bring them back and bury them, or not bury them. And we might cover that a little bit later. He was bringing them back, trying to collect them in larger gatherings. And then at the end of the war, those larger gatherings were then disinterred again. And they were put into these massive, beautiful, as you said, if you've been to them, they are most beautiful, peaceful, wonderful, bearing in mind what they represent, locations. And they were reinterred into the huge cemeteries, which are now the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries. It was all unknown. It was all unusual. It had not been done before. And so you have the work going on during the First World War and then the aftermath of the First World War to recover the dead, to honor the dead, to remember the dead. And at home, you had Mrs. Smith, plumber's wife in Hertfordshire or in Newcastle or in Merseyside, who'd had a telegram in 1914 that said, "Regret to inform you that your husband is missing, presumed dead, whereabouts unknown." Nothing. And that was it. So there's over 500,000 who knew nothing. And at the end of the war, the grief and the sadness became quite overwhelming, which is how the proposal to bring one unknown back to represent all the unknown came about.
Before we get into that process, we're talking about recovering the dead. Can you tell people a little bit more about what that entailed, who did it, and aside from the massive effort that must have been, just how, can you just tell us a bit more about that effort, and just so people really kind of understand what that entailed?
It was a terrible, terrible, terrible process. And so the start of the book and the theatre show is about High Wood. So High Wood was one day of battle on one day of this 4-month Battle of the Somme, which was just one day in the 4.5 years of the First World War. And there were thousands killed. And so I used the story of Padre David Railton, a military padre who incidentally won the Military Cross during the Somme for his bravery, a man who carried a Bible and no weapon. But he won the Military Cross, as a number of padres did. So he talks about burying the dead from the Somme, from the Battle of High Wood, one day over a month-long Battle of the Somme. And he talks about going in and picking them up and trying to give them a decent burial, an honourable burial. And he took his Union Jack with him and he used them to cover them. But in one occasion, after Highwood, he had to bury, I think it was 41 or 47 in a shell hole. So they are burying the immediate dead. Now, if you, the immediate dead that they could find. So there's a photograph in the book of Highwood in 1919. So 3 years after the major battle. And there are still bodies lying in the open.
My God.
The dead are still there. There's boots. I don't want to there's boots there with remains in them. There are skulls which have now been bleached. They've been, the remains have been eaten by animals. And in the corner of the photograph that I use, there's a white cross that obviously one of the burial parties put up and said, I can't remember what, a private or whatever is buried here, but scattered around are the remains of others. And so they tried to bury the dead as it happened, but they couldn't do everybody. And then at the end of the war, when we started to create the great cemeteries, they, disinterred the dead. So the dead sometimes have been dead for 3 years.
So disinterred, just for the infantry who are listening.
Sorry, mate. Sorry. I didn't realize it was an infantry-focused Yeah, you're right. They dug them up. So on the edge of the battlefield, there'd be a cross or an up-toed rifle and a helmet that said Private Smith, the 47th London Rifles. But then you couldn't leave them because this is farmers' land. So in the 1919, they had to be gathered together in great cemeteries. And so they then were digging them up. And if you look at the photographs and the accounts, and I don't know how far you want to go down that route, mate, but if you're trying to dig up a dead body that's 4 years old, that's pretty horrific. And to try to bring the story to life, as you know, I then interview people who've done the same jobs. So a lady, Professor Dame Sue Black, an amazing lady who was involved in the horrific deaths in Kosovo. And she was in Kosovo in the years after the war, disinterring, digging up the bodies, reclaiming the bodies. And she told me on a couple of stories about what it is like to recover a body. So one of the stories she told me was about the Serbs had put something like 50 or 60 men into a farmhouse and killed them, machine gunned them, and then burned the farmhouse. And so 3 years later, she went in to collect the bodies. Probably need a warning to our listeners because, it's sometimes quite horrific to be reminded of these things. So I'm going to describe something quite unpleasant. So she then talked about the reality of collecting bodies that had been dead for a couple of years. Just the physical process of collecting them. And suddenly you realize, so she talked about what it was like to do it 3 or 4, 5, 6 times. And then you realize that in 1918, 1919, they were doing this on tens of thousands of occasions to reclaim them and to put them into the great graveyards. And one of the things, and I printed this out so I got the figures right. So they were collecting the bodies after the First World War for many years. So from 1921 to 1928, they discovered 28,000 bodies. 28,000. 28,000 in the 7 years in the early 1920s. And what I found staggering was after that, up to 1937, so only a couple of years before the Second World War, they discovered another 10,000. So before the fighting of the Second World War had started, in the 7 or 8 years before that, they discovered 10,000 of the dead from the First World War. And when you look at those figures, you begin to understand how difficult it must have been for those burial parties back post First World War.
And who's carrying out this work? Is it the French?
Well, there was the director of Graves Registration and Recovery Committee, I think I got that right, who were responsible, but it was a lot of volunteers. And when you read the accounts, it was a horrific job. And many of the men would have suffered clearly from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, without a shadow of a doubt. They really did. And there's one, again, quite graphic description of a man who's trying to, I don't know how far you want to go down this. You might have to remove this from our chat, but he talks about picking up the remains on a spade, but they were so desperate not to bury the unknown. They wanted to find out who they were. And so in the latter stages of the war, they wore dog tag, not always at the beginning. And he talked about trying to find the dog tag around the neck of a man who'd been dead for 6 years. And I won't describe it more than that, but it is a really brutal story. And that's what our forebears did, guess. That's what they did back in the day.
Well, I think it's important to know, because we all know about the horrors of the trenches. I think it's important that we know about that it didn't stop there. And I also think it certainly for me, when I went to, these graveyards recently, after having read the book, it made me see it in a different light.
Yeah.
Because when you realize what went into actually getting those, people in there, you start to have a whole new appreciation, because you've always had the appreciation for the people in the graves. Now you have the appreciation for the people who put them there. You mentioned having modern voices in the book. I thought this was something that really took something that was already powerful, made it even more so. Because the First World War is kind of so long ago that we can almost think that it's almost like a bad dream. And then you kind of bring it, really to life with these kind of modern accounts, as well as speaking to experts. Did you speak to people who were, you mentioned the Padre, was there family members and people like that who knew who you could build, to kind of bring more out about these people?
So I spoke to a number of people who, obviously there's nobody alive now who served then, but Padre David Railton, who won the Military Cross at the Somme, and he was the instigator of the idea for an unknown warrior to represent all the missing. I spoke to his daughter-in-law, which was a massive privilege and a massive pleasure. I went to see her in her home. Sadly, she died a few months ago. And she told me about this man who had seen so much, had done so much. And if you read his diaries, good Lord in heaven above, guess. I mean, he was there for 2 years. His writings on the subject, either that he wrote himself at the time or sent letters to his wife, are really moving, really incredible. Bearing in mind that he never spoke about his feelings. He never really spoke about the brutality of what he saw, but the simplicity of his words is astonishing. And speaking to his daughter-in-law, so his family never spoke about the fact that he won the Military Cross. Can you imagine any of us now who'd won the Military Cross?
It'd be all over my Instagram page, mate.
There'd be badges everywhere, pal. He'd won the Military Cross, and it was never, ever mentioned. It was never seen. I said so, but he must have had it. He must have worn it. I don't know, on armor. No, he never spoke about it. He never wore it. He never said anything about it. He proposed the idea for the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior in 1920. Nothing. Never mentioned it. So these people, first of all, they were from a different generation. And so they, didn't wear their hearts on their sleeves, which, is kind of understandable. They didn't really talk about their experiences. And his daughter-in-law actually brought this into focus because she said, everybody had been infected. Why would you talk about what you'd seen and done in the trenches? Everybody in the village, everybody in the town, everybody knew somebody who had fought or died or had been lost. You simply did not talk about it. And so to try to then understand what they did. So Padre David Railton is the classic example. So he talks about burying the dead, his desire, his care in burying the dead, and also desperate not to bury the unknown. Who could I talk to that can bring that to life? Well, I had met a couple of years before a padre from the Falkland Islands, Canon Alf Hayes. And so I knew Alf's story. He'd been with 5 Brigade. So he'd been at Bruce Green with the Paras. And I've been to the Falklands, and I've been to the Argentinian cemetery, and I've seen the graves. And I have noted somewhere in my head that many of them said when I was there in 90, Well, I first went there in 91 or 92, I think. Many of them said, an Argentinian soldier known unto God. And I'd never thought about that. How in 1982 was somebody not identified? And so speaking to Alf Hayes, he explained, because he did it. He buried them. He buried them so they got a tractor from one of the farms, dig a trench. In the same way that Padre Railton had done in 1916, Padre Hayes had done in 1982. Because they'd collected the dead from the battlefield. After Goose Green, and they were everywhere in the heather. They'd collected them and they'd brought them together, and they had to bury them in a mass grave. And he told me, and it still moves me now. He said, I treated them with the same respect that we did with the bodies of our own, because I wanted to be able to say, whether it's in a year's time or whether it's in 5 years or 10 years' time, when I meet the relatives of the Argentine dead, I want to be able to say to them, I gave them a proper burial. I buried them as though they were my own, so that you know that we cared for their bodies. And I said, but how were they unknown? He said, well, because they didn't have ID. It didn't. So they had some of them had 5 sets of rosary beads around their necks, and they had pictures of the Virgin Mary taped to their FN rifles, but they had no ID. And they conscripted Argentinian prisoners to help, but they didn't know who they were. So 1982, we were burying the dead unknown. And so when you try to bring that, it really brings it to life when you understand and you speak to somebody about what it was like to bury the dead.
And the padre who came up with the idea, obviously, I love padres, but they don't have the power to get somebody buried in Westminster Abbey alone.
Oh, yeah.
Or, well, they need a little bit of a team effort on that one. That is a fascinating story. Obviously, we can't get into to everything on here, but I mean that the story of how that happens is fantastic, and I'm sure that's a part of the talk. It's a big part of the book, and I found the whole thing fascinating, particularly because of the time constraint on it, which is it's just like government and stuff 101. It's like, we've had this great idea. It's like, right, well, we've got to fit it into this thing. And that to me is that's something that I don't want to just kind of get into in a few minutes, because it will not do it justice. But what I do want to kind of talk about is just the importance is, I like to think has made a resurgence in this country in the last couple of decades. And I'd like your take on where the unknown warrior fit into the idea of remembrance at the time and where it fits in now.
Still vastly important. So if you speak to people who have lost loved ones in the various conflicts we've been in, even where they have a known grave, the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior is important because it's a focal point. So if you go to Westminster Abbey, I think there's 3,500 graves in Westminster Abbey, and the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior is the only one that nobody walks on. So if you've seen the late Her Majesty, King Charles, any of the royal family, any prime minister, any president coming in, they never walk on that slab of black marble. Everybody else walks. They walk over every other grave. So it's still really important. Remembrance, commemoration, a recognition of sacrifice is hugely important. And I try again to bring that to life. So I speak to a lady who lost her father in the Falklands on HMS Coventry, whose body, who went down on HMS Coventry, and so nothing was returned home. She has nothing, no possessions. She has the letters. Yes, seriously. You and I have written letters before, and we've had letters from our loved ones. There's a picture in the book of 2 letters that are returned to her family, and it has a stapled note on it. And it says, regret to inform you that the recipient is presumed dead. This letter is returned. Can you imagine that now? The recipient is presumed dead. Yeah. This letter is, it's unbelievable. And so I talked to her about having her father with no known resting place. I talked to somebody who's a friend of mine who was killed at the start of the Gulf War in 1990, who was in a tornado crash at sea. His body was never recovered. So his wife, his children have got nothing, no place. But one of the most moving pieces, God, I'm going to start crying in a minute. I speak to Nikki Scott, whose husband, Lee, was killed in Afghanistan in 2009 in one of the worst days. I think we lost 9 or 10 people. And I speak to her about what it was like to lose your beloved husband and have his remains returned. So she talks to me about what it was like to wait at RAF Lynham when the coffins were returned. The ceremony at Wootton Bassett, and we're going to go off on a slight diversion, but the ceremony at Wootton Bassett did not happen in the early days. The bodies came home and they were put in hearses and they were stuck in traffic. And I talk in the book about how the whole thing started because a hearse was stuck behind a skip lorry on the main high street in Wootton Bassett. Nobody there. Now, I mean, we remember Wootton Bassett's now Royal Wootton Bassett because of its wonderful tributes. So I talked to Nikki about why it was important for her to have her loved one's remains home so that she has a place to grieve. And what really hammered me, and I was in absolute tears with her about, was that she could say to her 2 children, their father, this is where your father lies. This is his grave. You can go there. You can speak to him. Nobody else will hear. You can tell him about your hopes. You can tell him about your fears. You can tell him about your dreams. And only he can listen. Wow. That really tells you how important having a place to grieve, a place to commemorate is. And I hope that I brought that out.
Yeah. I mean, where we are in the studio right now, there's a Live Village War Memorial a couple 100 meters away. And that's obviously, a part of it. But you see the names on there and you always just kind of assumed growing up that it's like, oh, they're buried somewhere. And now, reading this, it's realized it's like, no, a lot of them didn't have a place to go. And you see the importance of those places as well.
But that's what the First World War memorials that every village has got. I mean, mine is also 100 yards just over there next to the river. That was because the bodies were never brought home.
Right.
So known and unknown, the only place you could memorialize and remember was the village memorial. They weren't there before that.
I mean, it's obviously a terrible subject, but I also think it speaks to the character of the nation. I mean, Britain was the first country to do the unknown memorial, I think.
Yes. Yeah. So Reverend Railton started the concept of the unknown warrior, as you kind of alluded to a couple of minutes ago. And it happened like that. I mean, beyond comprehension that we could do that now. And we were the first, but then the French took it over, the Americans did it. And then I can't remember exactly, but tens and tens and tens of countries have now taken on the concept of having an unknown warrior who represent all. But ours is slightly different, guess. So we have the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey, which represents the unknown of the First World War, and that's all it represents. But we have the cenotaph, where I will be in a month or so's time for Remembrance Sunday. Cenotaph, again, the story behind the cenotaph is astonishing. So it started as a plaster and wood memorial for the first armistice parade, and it was just this knocked up thing for the 11th of November, 1990. And the response was so amazing. And they were going to, it was rotting, it was falling apart. They said, we're going to take it down. And there was this outcry. And so we now have the cenotaph that you and I now know, that was unveiled on Armistice Day, 1920, the same day that the unknown warrior was buried. And I did not know this. And I've been there, I don't know how many times. Cenotaph. It comes from the Greek keno and taphos, empty tomb. And if you look at the top of the cenotaph, and I've been there hundreds of times, I did not know that there's an empty tomb. And that is to represent all of the dead from all of the conflicts. And so I was just learning all these different things. Why didn't I know this? It's embarrassing that I didn't know these stories.
Well, I would say this, if we have any serving people listening or anyone involved in cadet forces or anything like that, I mean,
yeah.
I wish I'd known this stuff while I was in because, there's 20 plus remembrances I could have had since, joining up where I could have seen things in a whole different light. And And I do think, the book is about the 2 Million Warrior, but it's so much more than that. It really is a book about, you learn so much about everything about remembrance and how it came about. And it's just one of those things, like you said, you're reading it and you're like, you almost feel you're ashamed. You're like, why didn't I know about this? And it shines everything in a new light. It shines the war in a new light. Which says something when you can already know something was probably the worst period to ever be a soldier, and then it gets even worse. But John, I'm sure we've wet people's whistle here. I know mine certainly has been. Where can people come and see you? Where can people find out more about the book and the tour and everything like that?
So the book has just come out. It's out now this week, and I'll be on tour. I've got, I think, 26 days around the country. It's going to be like, honestly, the army logistics have all organised it, mate. So I'm going to somewhere, I think I'm in Sunderland, and I've got to drive to Poole on the south coast, and then I've got to drive up to Liverpool. So I don't know who's organising the tour, but I'm doing it 26 days. So you can get the theatre venues and ticket details at johnnichollive.com. And I would love to see some veterans there. I'd love to see some military people, the ex-military people. And I might even stand them a gin and tonic if they let me know they're coming.
I will attest the fact that you're a very generous man with the drinks. So I think John will stand by that. I'll link everything up, guys, if you they go on the show notes.
Thanks, mate. Thank you.
Mate, any parting thoughts?
I started the project of The Unknown Warrior as a book about history. And as I changed the subtitle, it became a personal journey. And I discovered so much. And for me, speaking to the current generation, so Swede Williams, ex-Royal Artillery, became Army Air Corps, it's just joined the Air Force. Wow, who would do that as a helicopter pilot? His story about his experiences, what remembrance means to him, really, really, really hit home. And the stories of the Falklands, the stories of Nicky Scott, whose husband was killed, and one of my greatest privileges, talking about the ceremony in 1920, going to speak to the Garrison Sergeant Major, Mr. Stokes, about what it's like to organize a massive state occasion, was absolutely enlightening. You see these things go on, but when you speak to the man who did it, you really begin to understand. And he gave me a cup of tea in his office. It's never happened before with any Garrison Sergeant Major.
I was even scared of the bloke reading about him in a book third hand. So good for you for going to interview him. But John, thanks so much for your time, mate. Always a pleasure, and best of luck with the book. It's a terrific book, and it's a very important book, I think. Both for veterans and as a nation, I think it's a book that we needed. So thank you for writing it.
That's really kind. Thanks, guys. And mate, thank you. Your books are astonishing as well. You've done an amazing job. So, hey, who would have thought two kids from the back end of a council estate somewhere could end up like this? Who would have thought it?
I lived on the back end of a council estate. My house was pretty big, though, ain't gonna lie.
Well, I lived on the back end of a council estate. My house was minuscule.
All right, Joe. Thanks very much for your time, mate. I'll chat to you soon. All the best, mate. Cheers.
Yeah, look after yourself, guys. Thanks very much, mate.